Then we're going into the band is broken up. They're starting to do different things. The first thing that Jimmy Page does after the breakup of Zeppelin, that's musical, that he actually puts out is the soundtrack for the movie Death Wish 2. Death Wish was a movie with Charles Bronson. Death Wish 2 is the sequel, and Jimmy was contracted to do the music for this soundtrack, and he did it all himself. They gave him cuts of the edits of the film so he could show the film and come up with like the music parts to match the film. He did a great job, honestly. And it's not so much that this is like consumable music in its own right. There's like two songs that are songs. The rest of it is a lot of soundtrack stuff, really, just music in the background during film footage. But you have Who's to Blame, and I think you have, what is it, City Sirens or something like that is the other one. And Who's to Blame is kind of like a bluesy uh, pop single kind of thing. And clips of this were used within the movie, but the soundtrack had the whole thing. And here's the first time we see Jimmy Page using a Roland guitar synthesizer. He, for whatever reason, he took to wanting to do this job.
What's a rolling guitar synthesizer?
In the early 80s, people were trying to make guitars become synthesizers so that a guitar player who knew how to play a guitar, if you hit those strings, you'd get symphonic synthesizer sort of sounds out of a guitar rather than
Oh
out of a
wow.
keyboard. And it was a much harder thing to do to get it out of stringed instrument than it was to get it out of like a electronic keyboard where you're just sampling stuff. But anyway, it's almost better to go watch the movie Death Wish and pay attention to the soundtrack than it is to go listen to the soundtrack.
Yeah, it's a classic revenge movie, man.
Yeah, it really is. It's it's a ghastly movie in terms of
Oh, it's
it,
ugly. It's nasty. They
yeah.
don't make them like that
No,
anymore.
it's good. I mean, if you like Charles
Yeah.
Bronson and if you like the first one, you'll like this one. And, but I mean, it's hard to watch. It's not easy subject matter. But Jimmy Page's soundtrack really does make this movie shine in a way where if you're just listening to the soundtrack as an album, it's not so interesting. In context with watching the movie, it's pretty damn good. And then again, later on, Jimmy would resurrect Who's to Blame and I think City Sirens and play them on his Outrider tour in '88. So after he does that, the next time Jimmy Page pops his head out of the ground and sees his shadow is at the Arms concert, the Ronnie Lane Arms concert. Ronnie Lane was the musician in the band, the Small Faces, that a lot of those guys, a lot of the 60s heroes were comrades with. So Ronnie Lane develops MS and they start doing some tribute concerts. And you get, for the first time ever, Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimmy Page on stage together playing some songs together. And a lot of it was a train wreck. Jimmy is now so heroin chic that he looks like he might weigh 90 pounds. He's wearing a big suit to cover up how skinny he is and everything. And he gets out there and he does a couple of things and he plays an instrumental version of Stairway to Heaven, which isn't bad and all. But it's like the main takeaway from that I remember is like, God, he looks like he's going to keel over and die.
Yeah, he looks scary thin there.
Yeah,
It's crazy.
right. So he does that. And on that tour, he's playing some songs with Paul Rogers
From Bad Company.
and Free before Bad Company. So Paul Rogers and Jimmy Page start talking and they decide what if we made a band together? And they decide to make a band together and that band becomes The Firm and they get Tony Franklin, who's a fretless bass player who would later go on to play with John Sykes and Blue Murder. Great bass player. And Chris Slade, who is sort of he had some time in ACDC as a fill-in for the normal guy in ACDC, but pretty much a straightforward banger, like a 2/4 guy banger drum player. So you now have another 4-piece band with Jimmy Page on guitar, Paul Rogers on vocals, and this rhythm section of Chris Slade and Tony Franklin. And people were wondering, what's this going to sound like? What's this going to sound like? And when it finally hits, no Jimmy Page fan that I knew was like really thrilled about it. They're like, this doesn't sound that good. It wasn't that great and it wasn't that strong. And Jimmy was still up to his ears in heroin.
Yeah, their popular songs were Radioactive and Satisfaction Guaranteed.
Right.
I listened to it for a little
Really
bit, but
sleepy shit. Really sleepy
yeah,
shit.
wasn't
Uh,
that interesting, really. Just generic 80s bullshit.
Maybe because Jimmy's nodding out on heroin, it's music to nod out to. And Paul Rogers, the only Paul Rogers I really care for is Paul Rogers and Free. A lot of people disagree with me, but I'm not a huge Paul Rogers fan, and this did me no favors either. This is some sleepy ass music. And every now and then there's like a moment of like, oh, Jimmy. But most of it is really not so great. The first album was called The Firm. The second album was called Mean Business. Mean Business was a little better than the first one, in my opinion. But still, a lot of this stuff is really forgettable. And I went to see them live.
Really, where did you see him?
It was the first, I think I saw them in Worcester or in Providence. And this was the first time I ever saw Jimmy live. And boy, was I disappointed. He sounded terrible. He couldn't play in tune. He was so under the heroin blanket that he was playing the songs, but it just sounded terrible. And the whole band sounded like a concrete block slipping into mud. And it just didn't really work for me.
What year was this?
I want to say 85, something like that.
Man, he was fucked up for a long time.
Yeah, and again, he looked even worse. If you think he looked bad in the Arms concert, he looked even worse. And it just wasn't working in my opinion. And I don't know any people who really rated the Firm that highly.
Good name for a band, though.
People were dying to like it. People wanted so desperately to like it. And this is like the emperor has no clothes, right? This is the classic thing where it's like, I so want to like what Jimmy Page is doing, but it just sucks so bad. And it was just awful, in my opinion, anyway. And then between 85 and 88, he does kick the heroin. And he comes back with his first solo album called Outrider.
1988.
Yeah, and this was a breath of fresh air. This was Jimmy back to writing Jimmy like songs with Jimmy like energy. And he wasn't quite the lead player anymore, but the album, in terms of a set of songs, it hung together. Now, it did somewhat suffer from the fact that it had multiple vocalists, so it didn't have the cohesion of one singer throughout the whole album, but these are stronger tracks.
You got John Miles, you got Robert Plant, Chris Farlow on vocals, and a bunch of instrumental tracks.
Yeah. So we get it starts off with this it immediately starts off with this catchy riff in Wasting My Time, which is a great Jimmy riff, and it's one of those ones where he turns the beat around again, and it's really strong. And I'm like, I was in a record store and this came on, and my ears just went up, and I'm like, I didn't even know who it was, but I immediately heard it, and I'm like, that sounds like Jimmy Page. And then I heard the vocalist, and I didn't recognize him, and I'm still like, this still. And I'm like, what is this? And he's like, Jimmy Page. I said, thank you, I thought so. All of a sudden, it's like Jimmy Page rears his head, and it's like, hey, I'm back, I'm clean, I can play again.
And Jason Bonham plays drums and percussion in this one too.
Right, and he's really good on it. And then the next song on this album is called "Wanna Make Love," and it's this nasty drop D riff that is just nasty, and Jason really gives it a lot. And all of a sudden, we're back into like Jimmy being heavy guitar player again after this time in the Firm where he's like, MIA.
And then we get Rite of Winter.
Yep, which is sort of, less spectacular, but sort of like this up tempo thing that's sort of like acoustically rhythmical in some ways. It's a nice up tempo track. And then we have, I guess, the Robert Plant track is called "The Only One." And for what it's worth, this isn't the strongest track. It's you hear Robert Plant and Jimmy Page for the first time in a long time together, and it's good, but it's not like a stellar track or anything like that. There are better tracks on this album.
But they remained friends and they kept in touch after Zeppelin
Yeah,
was
and
over.
obviously they were going to work together again soon. But yeah, um, and then you get into an instrumental called "Liquid Mercury," again, really heavy, and Jimmy just it's a very heavy guitar track.
I quite liked the production on this album. Did Jimmy also have full control?
I'm pretty sure he produced it, especially if it was going out under just his name, right? And then you have this track called "Hummingbird," which is kind of like this. This is a nice song. It's again a very much a classic Jimmy Pageism sort of guitar part, but it's sort of like it's like a blues without being a blues. It's a ballad, really, but it's a good one. And it's got a very different kind of vocal on it than you would get from a Robert Plant or something like that. So on Emerald Isles, you get again like loads of Jimmy Page sort of trademark melodic thoughts and ideas and rhythmic ideas. Everything about this just screams Jimmy Page. It's an instrumental acoustic, at least semi-acoustic number where it's got all of his like Celtic leaning acoustic ideas and things like that. Go with the name Emerald Isles. What are you thinking? I mean, it's like so it's got this Celtic flavor to it, and just a nice track again with big guitar sounds, no vocals, some drumming, but it's really just letting the guitars shine, and there's a lot of them on this track.
And then we get Prison Blues.
And Prison Blues, we come back to yet another one of these tracks where Jimmy would always put like a stock blues track on an album, and this harks back to like "I Can't Quit You Baby" and "You Shook Me," and all of a sudden here it is again, and it's a nice track, and it's
7 minutes
a
long.
really good bluesy vocal too. But this is like on this track, this is where Jimmy shows, he's still got a little bit of lead chops left and he goes for it here. But I mean, we've seen in the last few albums, whether it was T for One or I'm Gonna Crawl, he puts one of these blues tracks on most of his albums. And this is the one for this one. And this is Folsom Prison Blues reinterpreted or something like that. But it's a strong track, and it's a strong track with him on electric.
And then we get Blues Anthem, If I Can't Have Your Love.
Yeah, and I remember reading somewhere say this is, the blues anthem is neither a blues nor an anthem, but it's a ballad, and it's nice, and it's a good song. And again, it's sort of the vocalist sort of singing his heart out on his sleeve and stuff. It's an interesting first solo album from a man who's done so much because it's got instrumental tracks, it's got tracks with different vocalists on it, it's got acoustics, it's got electrics, it's got all of the flavors that he's known for, all of the rhythm things that he's known for, the blues thing that he's known for. If you want to condense Jimmy Page down to a resume, there are better songs in Zeppelin, obviously, but I mean this is kind of like Jimmy Page putting out his resume as an album.
Chris Farlow, what can we say about him? What other bands do we know him from?
I don't know what he's known for. I mean, it's one of those names that you always heard in the British scene, but I mean, he never cracked through in anything I ever heard by himself.
Just a talented guy who never ended up in like a super big band somehow.
And we talk about the guys like that and Terry Reid, the guy who could have had the gig in Zeppelin and stuff like that. These guys, I saw this tour with Jimmy Page, and he was clean, and he was playing wonderfully, and he was playing a lot of Zeppelin stuff. And John Miles, the guy who did some of the vocals on this, was the singer on the tour, and Jason was on drums, and he was playing not only songs from this. He played "In My Time of Dying," he played "Over the Hills and Far Away," he played a bunch of Zeppelin stuff, and he killed it. It was wonderful. As bad as my concert experience was with him with the Firm, when he came back through in '88 clean, he played his ass off and killed it, and I was absolutely thrilled to see him go out there and just be Jimmy again. And it was great. We go to Coverdale-Page in 1993, and this album, for me, I love this album. I still love this album. This album to me is like Jimmy Page returning to being most of what we love about Jimmy Page. His lead chops are not here anymore, but the songwriting, the Jimmy Pageisms, the kinds of songs he was writing, Robert Plant wouldn't work with him at this time. Robert Plant was trying to get his own career off the ground and doing quite well, by the way. Robert Plant, from 83 to 93, was having a very successful solo career with putting out great albums. So he didn't need Jimmy Page anymore at that moment in time. So when Robert wouldn't work with Jimmy anymore, Jimmy went and found David Coverdale of Whitesnake, who is in many ways, let's just say, of the Robert Plant school of blues singers.
He was also a lead singer of Deep Purple for a while.
Right. Great singer, great, wonderful singer. But a lot of people looked at this album and said, oh, they're just ripping off Zeppelin. Like, no. This is way better than that, in my opinion. This is Jimmy Page writing the way he used to write with a different singer who is in the same genre. And this album, to me, is a really strong album. And it's, by the way, one of David Coverdale's strongest albums in a long-ass time. Jimmy Page pushed David Coverdale to put out to really do his best. Don't forget, this is after Whitesnake 87. This is after Still of the Night. This is after all of Whitesnake's prime time.
Yeah, and he also did Burn and Stormbringer before that with
right, when
Deep
he was
Purple.
a young man, and he was even better in those days.
Yeah.
So I feel I have a minority opinion on this album, but I love this album. To me, this isn't Jimmy ripping off Zeppelin. To me, this is Jimmy being Jimmy. This is Jimmy coming back to the Jimmy of Led Zeppelin and writing the kinds of riffs he would have written in Led Zeppelin had he been sober, right? You know, you start out with this bluesy thing like "Shake My Tree," which I think goes back to some sort of a blues standard and stuff. Great riff, great job by Coverdale. Even later on, when he played with Plant again, they covered this one, and even Plant was like, I'm going to sing this one. And "Shake My Tree" is a good, strong opener for an album that just gets better and better. "Waiting on You" is another big, heavy turnaround kind of riff, and again, Jimmy's pushing David Coverdale to do his absolute best vocal work he's done in quite a while. You get "Take Me for a Little While." That's sort of a ballad, but it's got these big, lush chords that you only associate with Jimmy. These big, lush, open chords. Everything about this album, on every track, you have Jimmy Page fingerprints all over it, and they're absolutely unmistakable. And then "Pride and Joy," which was the single, is just a kick-ass, ballsy stomp along the lines of stuff that they were doing a long time ago in Zeppelin, where it's part acoustic, and then the big heavy riff comes in that's electric and stuff, and the stop-start rhythms and the things where he's syncing up with the drums. This is a really strong track and a really fun track.
Yeah, it got airplay on MTV for quite a bit. It was
Right.
featured on Beavis and Butthead.
Well, I remember the day I first heard this track, and I didn't know what it was. First of all, I had heard, okay, Jimmy and David Coverdale are going to do an album. And I'm like, yes, please. Thank you. Give me some of that. And then there's like in the pre-internet days, no news. And then one day I'm flipping through the radio dial and I hear and I'm like, that's Jimmy Page. That's Jimmy Page. I know it. And then I hear Coverdale come in and I'm like, yeah, this is it. It was so unmistakably Jimmy Page in the part. And then you hear Coverdale and you're like, yeah, this is fucking great. This is what I want. Give me more of this. And then you have a song called "Over Now," which has like this droning beat, and it's kind of like nowhere near the kind of thing you'd get with like Cashmere or something like that, but it's sort of like a poppy, lighter version of a drony song like that. And really good job, really hypnotic, really sort of like mid tempo kind of feel to it, but a lot of fun. And then Feeling Hot Tonight is kind of like David Coverdale and having to inject his horribly cliched lyrics into a song that's just sort of like, this to me harks back to like the rave ups the Yardbirds would do. The guitar part on this is very much like what you would get out of the Yardbirds era Jimmy Page, or even the Yardbirds era Jeff Beck, and then with a Coverdale vocal on it. So Easy Does It is another one where it's like you have this incredibly Jimmy like open stringed rhythm guitar thing that when the drums kick in it becomes electric and it gets this thing. Again, this is the mixing of light and shade. This is the mixing of heavy and light. This is all the way back to the first album. You hear stuff like this. The kind of chords you're hearing on this song from Jimmy Page are just classic Page. Everything about it screams Jimmy Page.
with a very much 80s flavor, though.
Well, I'd say, I guess if you want, it's early '90s by now.
Yeah, but it
To
sounds
me,
like
it's just if you're talking about the production value, sure, but I'm talking about the construction of the song and the arrangement and stuff more than the production. It's certainly crisper and cleaner and much better produced in some ways, and with digital technology right now rather than all being analog tape.
actually I think they recorded it all analog because
Maybe they did, but I mean, even so, it's still very much recognizable as Jimmy Page trademarks, to me anyway. And then Take a Look at Yourself is sort of another ballad, big grandiose sort of ballad.
then we get Don't Leave Me This Way.
Don't Leave Me This Way is the epic blues track from this album. And David Coverdale sings his ass off on this song. And again, we're talking about a blues that isn't necessarily a classic 145 blues, but it's really powerful. And it's this slow, grinding creation of tension that this riff sort of circles back on itself and it builds and builds and builds. And in the old days, he would have given us a better guitar solo. But I mean, other than that, it's a great track. And like I said, some of the best singing David Coverdale had done since he was in Deep Purple on this track.
Then we get Absolution Blues.
Also, not really a blues. So this you have sort of like, if you will, the continuation of what he started on In the Evening with a little bit of wearing and tearing. So you have this big, atmospheric, weird entrance where he's playing very atmospheric kinds of out there things on electric, and then it kicks into a riff that's sort of reminiscent of Wearing and Tearing. This sort of chromatic kind of thing that he had, started on Black Dog and carried through on Wearing and Tearing. It's very much like that. Up tempo once it gets going, and really good.
Cool interplay on the beat with the drummer.
Yeah, which is another Jimmy Page rhythmic trademark, which we've talked about. The drummer is Denny Carmassi from Montrose and Heart. He is a absolute beast of a drummer in the John Bonham vein. He is definitely one of the sons of Bonham. If you ever listen to Montrose's first album, you listen to Rock Candy. That's pure Bonham influence. And Denny Carmassi did a masterful job on this whole album. He's a fantastic player, and he did a great job on this album.
Yeah, he also played with Sammy Hagar on his solo career and Ted Nugent.
Mm-hmm. Yep, he's been around. And then the last track is this big epic thing called Whisper a Prayer for the Dying, which is a wonderful track. It's really big, and it's like, again, you get all of the trademarks of Jimmy Page on this album. Again, this is another thing where it's like, if you want to hear all of the things Jimmy Page is about as a guitar player, and you want to hear it all in one album as a resume, this is a good one too. You hear all of the things he's about, both as an acoustic player and as a rhythm player and as an electric player. The only thing you don't get here is like absolutely astonishing lead work, but everything else is here. And Whisper Prayer for Dying is a really cool song that starts out again with like an acoustic intro, and then it goes into this really ripping electric verse. A fitting end to this album.
What's the reason, according to you, that his solo work isn't as good as his previous stuff? Because he wasn't super old, right?
No, but for whatever reason, his chops just weren't there anymore. I mean, you hear um, a little of his where his chops were on Outrider on the Prison Blues, but he's just giving you bits and pieces here. It's not like he's taking a long solo on any track anymore.
Right.
And when he does take some solos, they're more melodic things, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it's like what is conspicuously absent here are these epic solos that he used to be known for. But this album has everything else.
How old was he around this time? Early 90s.
I would say 49, maybe.
He was born in 1944, so quick math. Yeah, late 40s.
Right, and 49, you should still have your chops.
Right.
I got better after I was that age, and there's a lot of players who still have their chops at that age. So I don't know. There was talk at one time that he had some kind of arthritis or tendon problems or whatever it was, and his hands weren't nimble as they once were or whatever. I don't know how much of that I believe, or I really don't know. But he just stopped playing the kind of lead he was playing in the peak of Zeppelin, and I don't think it was because he wanted to personally.
Maybe because he just did it all, you know?
Yeah, but to me, this is an incredibly strong album that I enjoy to this day every time I go back to it. And I know a lot of people don't agree with me, but um, it's really a lot about what Jimmy was about as a player.
Let's see. There was also an ill-fated reunion for Live Aid in the mid '80s, which we maybe should mention.
Yeah, I mean, they got together for that. They had very little time to rehearse. It was very chaotic. They wanted to do it, but they didn't have enough time to rehearse. They had Tony Thompson on drums and they had Phil Collins on drums. And Phil Collins had flown in from the European version of Live Aid, and he took the Concorde over to make this set. It was really
Wow.
hectic and chaotic. Someone handed Jimmy the guitar right out of the case. It had never been tuned. It was out of tune. It was a shambles. I mean, people were delighted to see Led Zeppelin on stage again in any form, but it didn't come off very well. And and they knew it and they admitted it. And then they did the thing for Atlantic Records shortly after that. It was a tribute to Ahmet Ertegun, which was also hit or miss in terms of like how good the performance was. And they don't really get to right this ship until the Celebration Day thing. But also in there, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I don't particularly care for it. Jimmy Page did some guest shows with the Black Crowes where he's playing Zeppelin songs with the Black Crowes or a blues number with the Black Crowes. It's like, yeah, there was an album that they put out, but I couldn't care less about hearing him play with the Black Crowes, frankly. Uh, if you like it, great. If you like that, go and listen to Led Zeppelin. You're going to like Led Zeppelin a lot more.
That's a dog. He
Right.
agrees.
But then in the mid 90s, Robert Plant and Jimmy Page get back together and they do an album called No Quarter, which is a reinterpretation of classic Zeppelin songs in different ways. And they start touring again.
It was the MTV Unplugged thing.
Right, which was fantastic, actually. I thought that was wonderful. And then I got to go see that tour, and that tour was like the first time I actually got to see Page and Plant on stage together. And it was like a dream come true. And they were great. It was wonderful. It's not at the level that Zeppelin was in their prime, but they were still damn good and playing very well. And they were both in good shape and everything. And I saw that tour and I saw the follow up tour. They released an album together called Walking into Clarksdale, which I thought was terrible. New material for the first time. And their new material, I don't know too many people who liked it. Again, if you like it, good for you. But for me, I'm not even going to really talk about the album because I listened to it once or twice and I just couldn't stand it.
What makes it so terrible for you?
Songwriting,
It's just not there.
it's just not there. It's not like if he had given you another Coverdale-Page worth of kinds of songs and let Robert Plant sing on it. And by the way, I should point out the fact that Jimmy Page did an album with David Coverdale stuck in Robert Plant's craw and really pissed him off. And he used to say things like, "Oh, he's doing an album with David cover version," right? Because he knew that David Coverdale came from the same school of like the Robert Plant school of singers, and he didn't think much of Coverdale. At that time, David Coverdale was a much better singer than Robert Plant was by that time. So it kicked Robert Plant in the ass and said, maybe I should go back and work with Jimmy a little, or he's going to do this kind of thing. And it's going to sound better than what I can do with him. And they went back, and it was the real win in the Coverdale-Page thing was that it got Jimmy and Robert back together.
I gotta say, the one Robert Plant album I listened to for a good bit was the Mighty Rearranger, which I quite liked. It was from 2005.
Hmm.
And, I remember it came out then. It's like, oh, wow, Robert Plant, he's from Led Zeppelin, right? I was like 18 or something. And I was like, hey, I know that guy. And I just picked up the CD and listened to it and quite liked it.
I like some of his solo stuff quite a lot, particularly the first two albums, Pictures at 11 and Principle of Moments. Principle of Moments is probably his best solo work, in my opinion.
Very different than Zeppelin, though.
Right. It was very different, but it was very good. And then he did this album called Manic Nirvana, which he was leaning a little more hard rock again. And I love that one. But a lot of the other stuff was a little hit or miss for me with Robert. But they did get back together and they did tour again. And they did do this album called No Quarter. And they did do the MTV Unplugged thing. And all of those things were fairly successful. And those tours, I saw both of them. And I was like, I don't care what this cost me. I don't care what this ticket's going to cost. I'm going to find a way. I'm going to go see Jimmy Page and Robert Plant together for the first time. And I was not disappointed. And even though they were not in their prime, they were still able to really deliver a wonderful show. And then when they did the second tour, they did instead of doing it with like these Egyptian musicians and these the orchestral stuff, they did it as a stripped down 4-piece again and did more of the first 4 album stuff rather than like doing the big epic numbers from Physical Graffiti on. There's a lot more Lemon Song, a lot more Zep 2 stuff and things. They did it as a stripped down like 4-piece again. And that was interesting to see too, and that was also fun.
Mm-hmm.
But all of this eventually leads up to the reunion in 2007.
Well, in between there, though, he played guitar with Puff Daddy.
Yeah, we won't talk about that. I'm not going to talk about, Puff Daddy's shouting the wrong words over Kashmir. I'm sorry.
And he also made an appearance on stage with Limp Bizkit.
Yeah, another thing he shouldn't have done. And of course, he would jam with Aerosmith, and they eventually got inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And it was during the time that Page and Plant were touring without John Paul Jones, and John Paul Jones gets up on stage for his acceptance speech at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Says, "I want to thank my 2 friends here for finally remembering my phone number." Ooh, big zinger. Everybody went, ooh, yeah. Because everyone was like, why isn't John Paul Jones part of this reunion?
Yeah, that's kind of weird. He was a big part of the whole thing, too.
Absolutely, he was. So that was like, he totally dissed them in front of the entire world that night, which they deserved, by the way. They did deserve it.